Everything we've kind of talked about so far. We saw God, the Creator. He created all things, and then we saw the creation of man. And we saw the fall of man to sin, with the deception and the serpent in the garden, and then we saw the basically a little bit of the fallout of what happened after humanity had sinned, which was, we weren't allowed to be in God's physical presence in the garden. But the amazing thing was, in the last chapter, we saw that, even though we couldn't be in God's physical presence inside of the garden, He was still speaking with us. He was still speaking to humanity. He hadn't abandoned us. And so it's pretty interesting, because I think that says so much about the nature of who Jesus Himself is. We had this separation from God, but then Jesus steps into creation. He comes down into the wilderness, as it were, to lift us up. And you see God, He does the same thing, like as we're kicked out of the garden basically for our own good. God is still in our lives, at least in some. And in the last chapter we also saw some of humanity. They were still holding on to the purpose that God had given us. They were holding on to that relationship. Like I said, they were still communing with God, speaking with God, praying, doing all those things. And so we saw that God didn't abandon them. And then we also saw that they were, like I said, continuing in the purpose that He'd given them. Being caretakers and stewards of the animals and tending to the earth. They were farmers, shepherds, those sorts of things with Cain and Abel. And then, but then you also saw, like with the fallout of what happened in Cain and Abel's story, Cain eventually left from the presence of the Lord. And so he separated himself from God, the Creator. And the same thing, again, God says, we need to put a stop to this whole sin thing. So He places a mark upon Cain. I know he murdered his brother, so he was afraid that if he left, then people were going to come after him and kill him. And Pastor Jason talked a little bit about why that may be the case last week. But also, again, we saw God wanting to stop this before it goes too far kind of thing. God places a mark on Cain and says, I know you were a murderer. That doesn't justify anybody else murdering you. And so we're trying to put a stop to that. And you see God kind of trying to rein in the effects of sin. And like I said, you have some people leaving from the Lord's presence in Cain's lineage there. And then you have the other side of humanity. When Seth was born, the one that it said in the last chapter was basically God's gift to Adam and Eve, since they had lost Abel to what Cain had done. It said that Eve had said that God had appointed her another son, and they named him Seth. And then it talked that Seth had born a son named Enos. And that's where we pick up this week. And so, like I said, the big thing was you saw Cain's descendants, and through what Cain had done, you see sin progressively get worse. And we read about a man named Lamech, who, like Cain, he became a murderer, only he murdered more people than Cain did. And so you see sin getting progressively worse as the generations go on. And as humanity spreads, and as humanity tries to accomplish its purpose in being fruitful and multiplying, stewarding the earth, you also see sin being fruitful and multiplying, as it were. Sin getting progressively worse. And that's where we pick up this week. Because so last week we saw that sin was getting worse. Humanity was divided. Some were staying in this relationship with God, trying to maintain that relationship, and others were departing from the presence of the Lord. And like I said, we talked a little bit about it's not that different today. It's like some people want to have a relationship with God. Some people reject God and to go at life alone, basically. But so that's where we pick up this week. And before we go into chapter 5, I just wanted to remind us of what God originally said. So remember in, I believe, Genesis 3, or Genesis 2, I believe, before the fall, God had told them, in the day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall die. And so once they did that, then death entered into God's good creation. But if you look back at what we've read, we haven't seen anyone die naturally yet. No one has died. We've seen murders, we've seen sin leading to death, but we haven't seen actual, just like as we would say, a natural death, even though there's nothing natural about it in the first place. And so, the Bible talks about this It's this thing called the curse of sin and death, or the law of sin and death. And in the book of Romans, there's a verse that says, "For the wages of sin is death." So we know that the direct result of sin is being led to death, basically. So because of sin, we die. And then in Ezekiel, it actually says, "The soul that sinneth, it shall die." And so we know from later on in the Bible, obviously, but also we see here, like I said, sin is progressively getting worse, but we haven't seen an actual death yet. We've seen murders, but we haven't seen anybody die naturally, as we would say. And so that's where we pick up here in chapter 5. So Genesis chapter 5, we're going to start in verse 1. It says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him." So in the likeness of God, he made Adam. "Male and female," verse 2, "created he them and blessed them." We read that in the Genesis 1 and 2. It says, "And called their name Adam in the day when they were created." And some of your newer translations, that where it says called their name Adam, it'll say humankind or mankind. And that's because the word Adam, and this is a little nerdy and it goes beyond what we're reading here, but the word Adam just means humanity, basically. So the first man was named humanity, mankind, as it were. And then he named Eve, and also so on and so forth. And so when it says he called them Adam, it can sound strange, but really he called us humankind, basically. And it says, in the day that they were created. And it says in verse 3, "And Adam lived 130 years, and begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth." So Adam, after the Cain and Abel thing, when he's 130 years, he has another son, Seth. And watch what it says. It's interesting. It says, "In the days of Adam, after," verse 4, "he had begotten Seth, were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years." And pay attention to these last three words. "And he died." So, as we go forward, keep your eye open and your ears open, because that is going to happen a lot. And so often when we read these, we read this chapter particularly, we hear these really long lifespans, and we get so caught up in that we miss those last three words. And it's "and he died." So Adam, he has Seth, he lives about 800 years more, and all the days that he lives were 930, it says, and then he died. And then it says in verse 6, it says, "And Seth," so Adam's son, "lived 105 years, and begat Enos. And Seth lived after he begat Enos 807 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. And Enos lived 90 years, and begat Canaan. And Enos lived after he begat Canaan 815 years, and begat sons and daughters." So each generation, they're having the next generation, and they're multiplying. Like I said, the ones staying close to God and all those things, they're maintaining that relationship through, like I said, the son of Adam, the son that came after Cain and Abel's story, the one who would be on, quote unquote, the God side of the equation of humanity. You're seeing these long lifespans, and they're having sons and daughters. And it says in verse 11, "And all the days of Enos were 905 years, and he died. And Canaan lived 70 years, and begat Mahalalel. And Canaan lived after he begat Mahalalel 840 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died."
I see a pattern.
Yeah. And it's an important pattern.
Just shows if you live long enough,
You're going to die. But like I said, just like whenever we read Genesis, I believe it was chapter 3, when it said there was one thing that was not good after everything had been good. It's like this should really kind of come like a shock to us, because like I said, death is foreign to us so far in the Bible. It's like we've seen sin lead to murder, but we haven't seen anybody die naturally, as it were. Again, quote unquote, naturally. And so this should really hit us like a ton of bricks, because all of a sudden, even these people the ones of humanity who have remained in relationship with God haven't left his presence like Cain and his descendants did. The ones who are trying to maintain that relationship, even they're dying. It's like it didn't tell us anything about Cain's descendants dying or anything like that, but all of a sudden the ones who are still in a relationship with God, haven't left his presence, who are still maintaining that relationship or trying to, they're dying too. And that's going to be important as we go on. And so verse 13 again. It says, And Canaan lived after he begat Mahalaleel 840 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. And Mahalaleel lived 65 years and begat Jared. And Mahalaleel lived after he begat Jared 830 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Mahalaleel were 895 years, and he died. And Jared, his son, lived 162 years, and he begat Enoch. And Jared lived after he begat Enoch 800 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. And so we'll stop there before we go on into Enoch's story. So like I said, the thing that's really striking is all of a sudden, even people who are still in relationship with God still are suffering from the curse, as it were. Death is coming for even them. It's like, and so it's not just this foreign thing where if you have a relationship with God, you don't have to worry about it. It's an unavoidable thing. And so yes, they're living for really long times, but no matter how long they live, just like you said, if you live long enough, it's going to happen. And so that's really, like I said, it's a big shocker, because in the last chapter we saw how sin was getting progressively worse throughout the generations. Here we see death is getting worse progressively throughout the generations. And now, just as humanity was being fruitful and multiplying, sin was being fruitful and multiplying. Now we see death as being fruitful and multiplying. And so you see those three things happen back to back, as it were. And so, like I said, it's even for those who have this, who are trying to maintain relationship with the Creator at the end of the day. And so now we go on to the story of Enoch, and this is a fun one. So verse 21, it says, And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. This is the first time in all of these generations that we don't see that there was a death. And so that's really interesting, and people have been debating for centuries what in the world is happening right here. But, like I said, it's interesting because what's amazing, and if you pay attention to like everything we read like close to 15 verses where at the end somebody died. And then all of a sudden we have this one little section where Enoch, all of a sudden we're not told that he dies. But he walked with God, and it says that God took him. And that is, like I said, people have a lot of different ideas about what that might mean, but I try to stay just with what it says here. It's like God took him. After everybody we saw that died, as death is being the fallout from sin, now we see death, like I said, being fruitful and multiplying throughout the generations, even in the people maintaining a relationship with God. All of a sudden we see this one, and it says that God took him. So it's interesting because, like I said, if you realize that all of a sudden death is coming into the world, and it's not what's the word? It's not showing favoritism in who it chooses. It's like it's impacting everybody. Then you realize that this verse right here in verse 24, for God to take someone, and we don't hear that he died, that's a big statement for the nature of who God is. Because, everybody was dying, but then all of a sudden you get this moment of hope where God says, everyone's dying, but watch what I can do, basically. God says, I still have power over death. That's not something outside of his scope. It's not something outside of his control. And it's interesting because, like I said, right at this point, you have basically the two divisions of humanity, the ones who have rejected God and the ones who are trying to maintain a relationship. And death, you see, is even affecting the ones who are still trying to maintain that relationship. And God is with them, like I said, and they're still maintaining that relationship. He's with them, maybe not physically, but through their prayers and their talking with God and all those things. And then we see this, and God says, everyone's dying, but just remember, I still have power over that. God still has power over death. And that's pretty amazing because, like I said, that's a shocker. All of a sudden, everyone's dying, then all of a sudden, God steps in and says, you know what? No. And it's amazing because, like I said, the division, like we get locked in on Cain's descendants and Seth's descendants, but really the big picture of what's going on with humanity is some people have rejected God, some people are following after God, and the ones who are following after God get to see this miracle of someone who somehow avoids this death in some way. And I think so often we can miss that because when you put your faith in Christ and you're walking with the Lord, as it says Enoch did, it's easy to see God's blessings. When He blesses your life, it's easy to see that. But people who are far from God, they're basically going through life alone, or at least they assume they are. They think they have to do everything themselves, and so when obstacles come up that they can't overcome, then all of a sudden their lives fall apart. And then all of a sudden it's God's fault. But it's sad because if they just realize that if you just come to the family and you walk with God, you'll see the miracles that He's doing even through the difficulties. And, that was a part of my becoming a Christian. When I first came to church, before I put my faith in Christ or anything, I just came to church basically to see what this whole Christianity thing was all about. And one of the first people I met, one of the first people that came up to me was Pastor Carl. And Pastor Carl, he was probably in his upper 70s at that point. And something I noticed about him was he was just extremely happy. He was always smiling. I never saw him angry. I never saw him frowning. And I told him one time, I was like, what I really appreciate about you, Pastor Carl, is I don't think I've ever seen you upset. You're always happy. And he's like, I get there sometimes, but it's not often. And he's like, and I don't, when I realize how blessed I am, I don't have that much to be upset about. And so that struck me, and like I said, that helped me look to Christ, because when I did, I realized what He had was something I wanted in my own life. It's like, and that's really this story. It's like you saw the ones who are rejecting God, left His presence, and you see the miracles that are happening in the ones that are walking with Him. And that's really the amazing thing that I read whenever I see Enoch's story. When you walk with God, miracles happen. It's like, and especially when you walk with God, you'll be able to witness the miracles happen. Because you're not just relying on what you can do anymore. And so we're going to go on now. We're going to go to verse 25. And this is another interesting story. Because remember in the last chapter we heard about a man named Lamech. His father's name was Methuselah. Here we're going to read about another man named Lamech. And his father's name is Methuselah. And so there's just a couple verses, 25 here. It says, And Methuselah lived 187 years and begat Lamech. And Methuselah lived after he begat Lamech 782 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. But stop right there. So before we go on, we all of a sudden were introduced to another Lamech. Only this Lamech is on the side of the people who are actually trying to maintain a relationship with God. So the first thing that like a person reading would think was, well, we just saw what happened with the last Lamech. And now he was a murderer. And in his mind, he was the best. Yeah. It's like, and now all of a sudden we see this other Lamech, and we're like, oh no. This is supposed to be the God-fearing side of the family. And so the first thing we think is, oh no, we've got another Lamech. But watch what happens. So verse 28. And Lamech lived 182 years and begat a son. And he called his name Noah, saying, This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed. And Lamech lived after he begat Noah 595 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. And Noah was 500 years old. And Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So we're going to get into the story of Noah next week. But the reason I point out that the contrasting between the two Lamechs is because this Lamech, instead of being a murderer and bringing sin and death into the world, this Lamech instead, he says this one is going to be is going to be responsible for bringing comfort to God's people. Like it said in verse 29, he called his son Noah, saying, "The same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed." And so it's the reason I bring up the two Lamechs, because you get this contrast between the two. One, on the God-fearing side of humanity, he's going to bring comfort, whereas the other one brought death, basically. And so you see this contrast, and whenever I read this, it made me think of something about my own life. So my wife, when she was younger, she met this man, and they had two children, my children, together. And he was not a God-fearing man, and he did a lot of things he cheated on her, he did a lot of things that were very ungodly. And in the end, she, as a young woman, was left to basically raise these children on her own. So she was left in a very difficult situation. And so her ex's name was Johnny. And it's interesting because all of a sudden I meet my wife at church, and my name's John. And it's just interesting because the one who was far from God, she was blessed even in that season because she had our two amazing kids. But her faith, staying close with God, whenever the second John shows up, who's on the God-fearing side, she was ready for that next chapter. It's like, and that's the amazing thing. It's like like I said, when you first read Lamech, you're like, oh no, not another one. But it's like, and that's the way my wife could have felt. It's like, I really hope this isn't another one. It's like she was very closed off, and she didn't want to introduce someone else into her kid's life. But because of the miracle that God has done, he brought her through that difficult season. He gave her comfort through those things, and then he brought in a new person that was going to walk with her and walk with God together. And I think, like I said, I think that's so amazing because it's like that's the way God over and over again has worked so far. You know, when things get rough, God always steps in. When things are looking really bad, all of a sudden God does something to either slow down the progression of sin or slow down the progression of death. And so just the big lesson is our God has the power over death. He has power over sin. You see that in these last two chapters. And be careful. This is just the lesson I learned as I read. Is that don't judge a book by its cover. Because right now, for humanity, like I said, all of a sudden this Lamech shows up on the God-fearing side of humanity. And you're like, oh no, not another one. But if you just write him off, then you won't realize, no, this one's actually going to bring comfort through Noah and what Noah's about to do in the world. And so you can't judge a book by its cover. Like I said, so often we get locked into Cain's side is the hellion side, and Seth's side is the good side. But together, God is working in all of it. That's the big thing. It's like, and like I said, it's like for my wife, it's like she had to go through that season to have the blessing of her two amazing children, and relying on God and walking with God. She met me in the church, and we've been married almost 6 years now. And so it's like, if we lose faith during the difficult times, and like Cain and his descendants in the last chapter, and we reject God and we walk away from the Lord's presence, it makes walking through the world that much more difficult. It's like when the difficult times come up, because remember, the God-fearing side, they're still suffering the effects of sin and death too. But the difference between them and the non-God-fearing side of the family, as it were, they have God walking with them. He's in a relationship with them. And that's really the big difference between the church and people outside of the church. It's like when you give your life to Christ, you know, we know that no matter what the world throws at us, we have Him with us. We have Him walking with us in the difficult times. And so, just to finish up, I love, like I said, we started with the curse of sin and death. And so we saw that after the fall, sin begins to be fruitful and multiply. And then death begins to be fruitful and multiply. But over and over again, God is pushing back against those things. And like I said, it's pretty amazing because, like, why do why is it so important that we stay close with the Lord? I think Paul sums it up in the book of Romans really well. He says, "There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus hath made me free from the law of sin and death." And like I said, it's amazing because death may seem inevitable for everyone. Like I said, we're all born into sin. We're all going to eventually face an unavoidable demise, as it were, like we see with the God-fearing side of humanity here. Just because we're Christians, we still have to go through that final moment of life. But the amazing thing is, no matter what, because of what Jesus did on the cross, we don't have to face the hardships of this life or face death alone. And the amazing thing is that God's going to bring us right through it. And that's the grace that God gives us. Like, just as with these people, they're suffering, they're seeing people, their family members die, but the beautiful thing is there's maintaining that relationship because God makes life that much easier. And like I said, I love this chapter because it contrasts the two Lamechs, and it makes you realize, like, it's not just about this person, that family, this family, or that family. It's about all of humanity, and God's working in all of these different places. And even for the people of God, the ones who are trying to maintain a relationship, life's going to be difficult because of sin and death. But we don't have to walk through it alone. It's because God's going to bring comfort.
That's good. That's right. So, just before we open up like question and answer time, of course it's kind of small today, but that's okay. Small group, but large brains.
I'm just saying, I nailed that time limit.
That's you did good. You did good. He's good. You were way better than Wolfie. Oh, that's on. So, just so we can just grasp this, it's interesting because when we look at this, remember it says chapter 5, verse 4, in the days of Adam, after he had begotten Seth, were 800, and he begat sons and daughters. So this means that it's more than just Cain, Abel, and Seth, okay? But what happens is there's this big division right here. And from now on, we are going to follow, the rest of the Bible is going to follow the descendants of Seth, this son. However, Adam and Eve had many, many, many children. Because we're talking 900 years, every 8 months, twin there, a triplet there, who knows? And so as you're going all the way, and for all we know, Cain and Abel, for all we know, it says that, anyway, but we're talking hundreds of potential children. But what happens is we start following Seth's bloodline. So we always have to remember that. So again, that's why there's so many different people on the earth by the time Noah comes around. And see, we look at Methuselah, and Methuselah here would have been Noah's dad. But if you're thinking, and when you do the math, I would love to have had my little chart. But if you do the math, that means that Methuselah was alive when Adam was still alive. There's a very good chance that Adam had a conversation with Methuselah and said, hey, you know what, let your great-great-great-great-granddaddy tell you all about God in the Garden of Eden. So it really is interesting to think about. So then Methuselah talked with Adam, more than likely, could have, talked with Adam about, hey, what was the Garden of Eden just like? And then I'm sure that he talked to his son Noah. And I'm sure that maybe Methuselah could have been alive whenever Noah's children were alive. So therefore, that would have been Granddad told us all about Adam in the Garden of Eden. And so it's very interesting because we all look at Noah and we all know what happened there. There was a great big flood. Everybody got destroyed except for Noah and his sons wives. So it really does take a really interesting swing because after the flood, all we have is Seth's bloodline. Everybody else is gone. So that's why we follow that. I wanted to mention that. And then we're going to talk with Enoch here in a minute. So.
And it's funny because it's like if you were Methuselah, man, if
if you're Adam,